Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar from Albany Law School online graduate programs team. My name is Will Trevor, and I'm the Assistant Dean and Director of the online programs here at Albany Law School. I'm delighted to have you here today for this webinar. In Employees We Must Trust, Understanding the Role that Technology and Analytics Plays in post-COVID-19 world with Dr. Michael Moon, who I will introduce in just a moment. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of housekeeping, first of all. We do have closed captioning turned on. If the words are not big enough, you can go into settings and you can increase the word size if you want to do that. There will be a recording made of this, and if you've registered as an attendee, which I'm sure you have because that's why you're here, we will be sending out a link to that at the end of this event. You'll note that we do have chat turned off, but we do have the Q&A section turned on. So if you have any questions for Michael during the course of the webinar, if you want to put those questions in there, when we get to the end of the webinar, we will have a curated number of those questions addressed. And those that aren't answered during the webinar, Michael has very kindly agreed that she will respond individually to those of you who have posed questions. There will be a survey posted periodically into the chat box for you to give us your feedback, and also at the end of the webinar, when the webinar closes, it will take you through to a SurveyMonkey survey. We would be very grateful if you would give us whatever feedback you can, so that we can continue offering these programs, and also that, most importantly, we can continue improving them as well. Next slide, please. This particular webinar is part of HR in Practice series, and it is offered to you in collaboration with the Capital Region Human Resource Association, the CRHRA. They are recognized by SHRM, the Society of Human Resources Management, to offer professional development credits, PDCs, and that's for the various SHRM certifications. The program is also eligible for HRCI credit. I will say, however, we have applied for those credits, and I don't see any reason why we won't get them, but it might mean that there's a little bit of a delay after the webinar before we can actually get you confirmation of those credits. But HRCI and SHRM credit is or has been applied for and will be available for this webinar. Next slide, please. Now, if you want to get involved with the CRHRA, the Capital Region Human Resources Association, they have various ways of doing that. You can network with professionals, you can subscribe to their newsletter. They do have complimentary networking sessions as well. And most importantly, coming up later this year, they will have their annual conference, which will be being held virtually this year on May the 1st. May the 5th. And so if you want more information about that, please email info@crhra.org. That's info@crhra.org. Next slide, please. And we launched earlier this year, as part of the Albany Law School online graduate programs, we launched a graduate program in HR. Its full title is Human Resources, Law, Leadership and Policy, which gives you some indication of the sort of focus of that. It is an HR graduate program that views things through a legal lens, and particularly for those HR professionals who are perhaps in that stage of the career where you're thinking about that next step into a more leadership position. Perhaps you have your eyes on becoming a sort of chief talent officer or that sort of position. It launched in spring 2021. It's a certificate, it's a master's, it's an LLM, and it can be completed in as little as 12 months. It is industry focused, and most importantly for HR professionals, it's aligned with the principles of SHRM, the Society of Human Resources Management. It's meant to be flexible. It's fully 100% online and asynchronous, and it's been developed by HR industry professionals for HR industry professionals. If you want to learn more about it, my colleague Nicole will be posting links in the chat box periodically, but give us a call on 518-390-0261. That's 518-390-0261, or send us an email to graduateadmissions@albanylaw.edu, and we will be delighted to tell you about our new Human Resources Law Leadership and Policy Program. Next slide, please. So in April, we have our next event. This is not part of the HR in Practice series, but this is a very topical subject, particularly in the headlines at the moment. The name of our next webinar is Cannabis Law, the Path to Legalization in New York. We've pulled together a team of experts and also attorneys and other folks who've been involved very much in the development of this legislation. That particular webinar is going to be Wednesday, April the 14th, and the time is 1 o'clock till 2:30. It was previously advertised till 2, but because of the topicality of this, we're going to make this one through from 1 o'clock till 2:30. Link in the chat box, and we'll be very pleased to see you there on April the 14th. Next slide, please. Now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce your speaker for today. Her name is Dr. Michael Moon. Now, Michael is a human capital management and people analytics expert who specializes in the application of social network theory and technology adoption models to help organizations understand the role they play in organizational and employee well-being. Now, she has over 15 years of the experience in HR and HR technology as a practitioner, researcher, analyst, and consultant. She's a highly sought-after speaker and conducts organizational research on a range of topics, including organizational culture, turnover, social capital, people analytics, organizational network analysis, employee engagement experience, and well-being. She's authored more than 25 white papers covering a broad range of HCM-related topics. She earned a PhD in human capital management from Bellevue University and an MS in human resources from Suffolk University. Currently teaching at Columbia University, and in 2019, she was named one of the top 100 HR tech influencers of 2019 by the Human Resource Executive magazine. So it is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Michael Moon.
Thank you so much, Will. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for taking time out of your day to come hear me speak. So I hope that my session today will be informative and leave you with some provoking thoughts about some of the things that organizations have been facing around the globe as a result of COVID. All right. So in today's session, what I want to really focus on actually is, let me step back a little bit, right? So if we think about, companies, have been feverishly trying to mobilize to address the challenges that they've been facing and continue to face as a result of COVID-19. This has resulted in new ways of working, and defining worker expectations are really top of mind. And for many of these employers, having a substantial remote workforce is something new. And when it comes, and with that are concerns over how and whether employee productivity and business performance will be impacted. Many are turning to technology to both monitor and measure employees, and this move can have detrimental consequences to trust, and can ultimately tear a what I really want to focus on are, I briefly talked already. I'm going to go into more detail. What is causing this in the use of tools and technologies, which we'll talk about, positively and negatively affect employees, but more specifically, if you're not using them correctly. I'm also going to talk about some of the tools themselves and the way that data is generated or the insight that's generated from the use of those tools, and different ways of us being able to, as I call it, use the data for good and not evil. And then obviously the role that people analytics plays in tackling some of the things that we're going to talk about here today. Next slide, please. So, I mean, I'm pretty sure everybody knows what this image is here, right? We're all very familiar with it. With the rest of the world, we watched in disbelief a year ago, approximately, as COVID-19 pandemic took hold at the beginning of the year. And a third, by this time last year, a third of the world's population was in lockdown. During this time, though, at the same time, we've also seen the speed and scale of change continue to accelerate, with technological advances bringing bigger and bolder changes in shorter periods of time, serving as a catalyst, forcing organizations to speed up their future of work efforts. An acceleration of an already hyper VUCA or 2.0 world has been amplifying the effect of pre-existing disruptions as interruptions are becoming normalized, and the pandemic has forced organizations to shift the way they think about how and where work gets done. Next slide, please. So before we dive in poll here, we're pretty clear that work from home is here to stay. We're hearing a lot of different companies come out and say, yep, you know what, we've decided 100% of our people are going to work from home. But I'd love it if you take some time here and just to point out that that second bullet is 1 to 20%, but I'd love to see, based on your organization and even just your own personal beliefs, to say you're just a student, what % of the workforce do you anticipate will actually be working remotely by the end of this year? We've, like I said, we've heard different companies come out and say, we've decided 100% go remote. We're seriously considering, definitely not going back to where we were at before. So let me give you about 30 more seconds and then we'll take a look at this.
Michael,
right.
just very briefly, you've had 1 or 2 bandwidth issues which affected the volume. You might just want to turn off your camera, which might improve things.
Okay, I will do that. All right. All right, let's go ahead and the clock went up. Let's end this poll here. So it's looking like, wow, looks like definitely more than 50, between 41 and 60%. So approximately, we'll just go in the midpoint right there. 28% of you said that about 50% of the workforce, right? And then another 25% said, right, so if we total that up, 53, 50, wow, that's like 65%, right? That's actually more than I had anticipated based on having heard other surveys and other events similar to this. So very, 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 very interesting. So let's talk about then, what are the implications of going to a majority work from home environment? So next slide, please. Okay. So I said, we've seen a lot of studies, we've seen a lot of news stories come out, right? I actually pulled some research from mid-May of last year. And at that time, right, we can see that work from home versus working from your business on premise, right, definitely was higher at that point. And now we're learning that that's even growing even more. Right. At the same time, there are organizations that have been able to show that as a result of employees being able to work from home, they've seen increases in productivity. But it's not necessarily, we have to kind of look underneath, we have to think about that a little bit more deeper. And we're going to briefly touch on it now. We're going to talk in much more detail on productivity measures and how we actually operationalize it in a later part of the presentation. But one study that PwC did, they actually were able to see that in the beginning of the pandemic, they definitely saw variability in performance increase, meaning the difference between your low and your high performer, and they measured that in terms of percentage of targets reached by a team. Right? They're able to see that very increase. And then a couple, they started to see that kind of that variability decrease. But what they were noticing, that it was a lot of the super achieving teams that were really carrying the rest of the business. And eventually, a month or two later after that, right, they started to see that variability. The average worker or the average performer is kind of, closing that gap. right? But there's that possibility, right, that we've got individuals who or teams that may be kind of taking up the slack from other individuals that maybe aren't as productive, and they could be individuals working from home or working not. We don't have that kind of insight into this particular study, but just something to think about, especially as we move into talking later about kind of negative effects of work from home. We also know that for a lot of folks, being able to work from home has helped provide opportunities for better work-life balance. Being able to, I know personally for myself, being able to go to the doctor, not having to worry about taking off time from work. It's been more of a focus about not how many hours am I working necessarily, but rather am I actually getting the work done that needs to get done. And also being able to remember to eat and things like that. But there's a lot of positive benefits for work-life balance. And then more autonomy. We're finding, that employees feel they do have a sense of being able to kind of decide how they're going to get their work done, whether it's sitting on their laptop on the couch or whether it's logging in first thing in the morning and then taking a break in the middle of the day, but also get more autonomy in terms of the way they go about the work that they do. And then lastly, we are also seeing, reports of organizations, and I put possibly in here, but increases in employee engagement or not seeing any decreases in engagement. Decreased voluntary turnover. And if we think about that logically, especially the turnover one, we're in a really tumultuous time right now. And so, you would likely not see as many people leaving your organization, given the state that we are with this global pandemic. And then we also don't really know, and we never, the kind of the levers that are pulling that increased engagement, right? And to think about, we don't know how it's being measured, right? Every organization may have their different way, right? It could also simply be, or not simply, but it could be that employees are just, they want to buckle down. They want to make sure they're doing a good job because they might be concerned about, losing their job. So there are a lot of things we don't know, right? But we have seen some very positive benefits to work from home. Next slide, please. So now let's talk about these negative effects. And if you want to go ahead and build the slide, Tom, that would be great. And I'm just going to talk to folks. So at the same time, and I put insert the name of any video conferencing tool here because I think Zoom gets a bad rep. So I decided I'm not going to call it Zoom fatigue. I'm just going to call it insert name of video conferencing tool fatigue. A lot of research that's pre-existing, but obviously new research and bubbling to the surface as well, old research. That the use of the constantly having to be on camera has a lot of negative effects for individuals. There's the kind of this constant, and you feel like everyone's always staring at you, right? There's critical self-evaluation where you're like, oh my gosh, can you see that gray hair up there? Oh my God, I need a facelift, right? Things like that. There's also this increased load because you're having to pay attention and everyone's watching you at all times. And there's that pressure that you feel and sedentary because I am in Zoom call after Zoom call after Zoom. Some of the ways in which work from home is actually leading to more isolation, separation, exclusion, which led to decrease your mental well-being, and then burnout and exhaustion, which comes with all of that. So workplace burnout is actually defined as a psychological state of emotional exhaustion in response to chronic interpersonal stressors in the work on the job. And so the pandemic, for many of us, has actually put more hours into our working day, right? Creating exhaustion and burnout, and simultaneously exposing the stress that many of us face in trying to balance our professional and personal demands, as well as increases in personal commitments, and especially around taking care of families, right? And then lastly, and this one we're going to spend a great deal of time talking about in the next section, there was a Gartner study that was done kind of around Q2 of last year. And in that study, they actually saw that about 20% of respondents said they were either planning on purchasing or had already sent out RFPs for some or technology to track and monitor remote employees. Next slide, please. This one study, but I don't know if you guys can still hear me. Yep, there we go. We also started to see, like, if there's an image here on the left-hand side. Now, I myself did a quick Google study. I went out and I looked at search terms, and I could see the people searching for the terms productivity and employee monitoring software. And for the purposes of this presentation, you may see the acronym EMS or BTT, right? It's employee monitoring software or behavior tracking tools. It's really an umbrella, which were, again, I saw increased kind of spike, then it went down, and then increase again right around August. We started hearing about organizations thinking about, like, let's get people back to the workplace. So, it makes sense to a certain extent. Their leadership is very worried about organizational stability and the effects of work from home on productivity and profitability. But at the same time, what we also started to see was many of these vendors actually changed how they marketed their products and making claims about being able to show improvements in productivity, being able to effectively monitor productivity and collaboration, many of them. But what this has really done is actually starts to signal to employees that they can't be trusted, right? And trust is so important with regard to so many outcomes in the organization, especially for social capital, which we're all really right now not having it. It's that there's connection of reciprocity that exists between, and so this technology is actually starting to start to erode some of that fabric. Next slide, please.
Michael, just sorry to interrupt again.
Sure.
You still continue to have a couple of bandwidth issues, which are just cutting in every now and again. Can I recommend that you perhaps, sorry, I've now got dogs. Would you mind perhaps turning off the smartphone or anything like that that might be using up your Wi-Fi bandwidth?
Yeah, I'm going to turn that on. Yep, put that on airplane mode. And there should be no other devices on right now. So let's just fingers crossed. So I'm going to briefly touch on this slide, but these are just some of the primary ways in which this software is working, right? So predicting and flagging tools, this is when the software is identifying or trying to just identifying when rules are being broken or perceived rule breaking, which can be helpful, right, for detecting fraud. But they also are used to augment some of the existing biased or potential discriminatory practices in the workplace, especially as we evaluate patterns of behavior. Biometric and health data, collected through tools like wearables, like Fitbit, other fitness tracking applications, and biometric timekeeping systems as well. For one example of this might be the use of fatigue monitoring software or systems, which are actually designed to decrease accidents through the use of the wearable technology, smartphone-based tests and dash cam systems, which is very common in the trucking industry. And they can be used to monitor things such as truck driver speed, driving behavior, pulse, heart rate, and even general state of mind or alertness. Like all really great stuff, right? As we'll talk later, what you do with that data is where you have to be very mindful. Right? Management by, sorry, I'm seeing the closed caption over here, and it said chocolatier. I'm like, I didn't say chocolatier. Sorry. Management by algorithm, we're going to talk about kind of a negative impact of that, but that's using an algorithm to kind of detect anomalies in patterns and performance, and then potentially sending workers nudges. Remote monitoring. This is used to actually manage and measure performance remotely, which is actually a big part of what we'll talk about at the end here, especially where people analytics can play a role. But sometimes that information is actually used to make decisions about performance or even whether or not to keep someone employed. and is definitely a good source of passive data. Again, if used correctly, can add a lot of value in the organization. And then the last bucket here is time tracking. Potentially, detecting possible wage theft. This could be actually a positive in the sense that this software might be tracking the difference between active versus idle time. And sometimes if you've improperly decided what is active versus what is idle, you may actually be not compensating the employees appropriately, right? So there's an opportunity here to just make sure the employees are paid correctly for the time that they put into work. Next slide, please. So briefly, in terms of what does all of this mean to the worker, right? We've talked about trust, so I won't really go there. But we do know from prior research in this space that the use of these types of software and tools can affect how people feel and think about their workplace. They actually can have been linked to increased stress, health risk, job dissatisfaction, and this sense of a lack of autonomy, right? So here we are giving employees more autonomy, working from home, but now they're being monitored. And then there's this kind of perceived forced or this perception of how, what a good working habits are versus bad habits. It also can modify on-the-job behavior. We tend to, so it can actually, it could actually help increase productivity. We've seen research that shows that, but it also can increase pro-social behavior, but it also can increase workplace deviance behaviors, finding ways to game the system, to get around the technology. I read one article about a guy that, he knew he was being monitored, so he just put up a Google Doc, right, and walked away. And the way that the company had set it up was, hey, if you're in these they were tracking what applications you were using. If it was open, then that meant you were working, right? And then can also, as I said before, positive impacts productivity, but also negative, right? We know working from home as well as the use of these tools can actually decrease creativity and innovation. So while we know working from home, we've seen a lot of research about it helping to increase productivity, when it comes to innovation, not so much, right? Because there's that lack of kind of accidental connections in the workplace. And that kind of the creative discord that exists, and not just from sitting in front of a camera and meeting with the same people day in and day out, but it's when you actually interact with people from different teams. Right? And then, as we said, trust. Next slide, please. Now, on top of that, right, we've got how does this impact employees? But now, we also know that this can have dramatic effects on employers, right? So on the left-hand side, I'll talk about Barclays. A report came out in kind of August about them being investigated. They were using some enterprise software to study workers anonymously for 18 months. And at some point, they implemented the technology. They actually switched it on additional functionality that allowed managers to actually pick out individuals and be able to look individually at whether or not they were, how long were they, it took them to finish a task, how long they spent actually away from their desks. And while GDPR does leave some room for employers to monitor employees in this manner, Barclays has actually been called out for not providing proper notice of the scope of the employee surveillance or its purpose. And GDPR does require that all employers notify employees of surveillance that's being conducted and the reasons why they believe it is necessary. And right now, they're actually facing a potential $1.1 billion fine. And then on the Amazon side, I'm sure we're familiar with a lot of the stories and articles that are out, right? But they're, the way it was described by one worker, a mysterious productivity metric that's powered by AI, this like kind of secrecy that's happening behind the scenes, and employees being fired for not meeting their workplace quotas based on these algorithms that are running behind the scenes. This again goes back to that management by algorithm. And in this case, right, we've seen increased protests of the company. It's bad publicity. There are some lawsuits from an ADA perspective, and increased worker stress and decreased trust. In fact, some of the quotes that I was able to grab around how this makes the workers feel, one of them was said, they don't trust us to work unless the computer's counting. Another said, it's created this constant buzz of low-grade panic, and the isolation and monotony of the work left me feeling as if I was losing my mind. Next slide, please. All right, so to make matters worse, or if that wasn't bad enough, many of the vendors that are playing in this space today make these claims that the use of their software have been able to show improvements in productivity, or that they can help organizations measure and understand who's collaborating with whom. But to be honest and frank, most vendors are simply not measuring things right, or even the things that really matter. From the productivity standpoint, we're no longer counting widgets, right? Showing up to work isn't enough, right? Many of these vendors merely are focusing on quantity of time, which doesn't tell the whole story. And employers end up with this false sense that they're measuring worker output, which lulls them into a sense of complacency. And then on the collaboration side, we're also seeing similar patterns where it's really focused on how many people, so quantity of the number of people I talk to, how many times do I meet with them? And vendors are claiming they are measuring collaboration, but in reality, they're really mostly they're measuring communication. And communication is that exchange of information needed to achieve a better understanding and has the possibility of benefiting only one party, while collaboration is that exchange of information and things to actually advance the state of a collaborative product that has a collective purpose. And even though collaboration cannot happen without communication and could potentially be seen as a proxy for collaboration, you really have no way of understanding how effective the communication is simply by measuring quantity and frequency of time individuals spend emailing, meeting, speaking, IMing. And really what they're doing is kind of measuring digital exhaust, which doesn't tell you what you really need to know. And so what organizations should really be doing also be doing, so I'm not saying we move away from quantitative measures, but also thinking about emphasizing the quality of the output, right? So measuring in terms of output or outcomes, potentially maybe adopting human capital financial metrics as a proxy for the measurement of productivity, especially where individual employee contribution cannot be easily isolated. For example, metrics like revenue per employee or human capital return on investment. And then on the collaboration side, again, on that quality, right? Focusing on, we think about just because two people meet on a regular basis, right? Doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually, so there's two potential, right? They could be meeting on a regular basis because they're friends and they really like working together. But they might be meeting on a regular basis because maybe they don't work well together. And so they keep having to meet over and over and over again. So, one measure, one person might say they're collaborative, but in one instance, what they're actually producing, the quality of that is not actually high, right? So we have to start to think about, rather than focusing on the individual level, I think for both productivity and collaboration, right? Start to look at kind of team level outputs. And emphasizing, how teams are working with one another, and then looking at more output and outcome measures. Next slide. So I have another poll. This is the last of the polls. So this poll here is really just around your preferred way of working now and beyond. Well, when we start to see the majority of companies say, okay, we're ready, what would you like to see in your workplace? Right. So we know some people, like for myself, I was working fully remote before the pandemic. I really like it, but I do like that flexibility to go into the office every once in a while, and especially when I need to brainstorm, and just also to help me create those kind of social connections that I might not otherwise get. There are other individuals, people I've talked to said, I can't work home at all. I can't do it. There's just too many distractions. I need to be in the office. Right. All right, we've got about 67%. Let's get to 75 and then I'll end the poll here. All right, it's looking like, wow, full flexibility to work anywhere, anytime. Interesting. So all right, full-time remote. Great. All right. So that's actually very interesting. I expected to be a little bit more on the full-time remote. a little bit less on the full flexibility, especially based on all the research I've been reading. Great. Okay. So here we go. Looks like most of you do not want to be back in the office full time, and you do want that flexibility. And the reason I wanted to actually talk about that is this next slide. We're actually going to talk about, okay, so work from home is here to stay. We're going to be using video conferencing tools, right? And these behavior tracking tools or employee monitoring software, there are good reasons to use it, right? So if we're going to use them, here are some things we need to be thinking about, right? On the left-hand side, we'll just talk really briefly about work from home. So giving employees a choice, which is why I asked that question, right? So giving employees a choice about when they come back to the office, about how many days they work in the office. Obviously, there needs to be some sort of structure around that, but really spending the time to understand what your employees need, how they feel about it is going to be incredibly crucial. And as we talk about in the last section of the presentation, that's where people analytics can really help. But not only giving employees a choice about working from home, but also about being on video. So, that begs to say, let's avoid these kind of forced options everyone has to be on. Are there opportunities where maybe you don't need to have the video on for a call? Or maybe you only have a video on for a portion of the call and the rest of the time that you have it off. So do all meetings need to be on? But we also need to think about some of the potential, and I think I talk about this in the next slide, but we may skip over it for the sake of time, but also in some states, right, there are wiretapping laws that we have to be aware of that actually explicitly forbid the recording without two-party consent. And even though you can say at the beginning of a presentation, just as a reminder, which you should, you're being recorded, forcing that employee to participate in the video is not the right way to go. So just be mindful that you don't always know where all the attendees are, right? What part of the country or the world they're sitting, and there are both state and federal laws around wiretapping. And then the last one around that is really kind of rethinking performance evaluation. We talked about thinking about teams, right? So employees being evaluated based on team performance right now from an individual performance level may not be the right way to go because they feel disconnected from that team. So we may rethink how we evaluate what is performance, and it definitely shouldn't be how many hours you're sitting at the computer or how many meetings you attended. And on the employee monitoring side, this again is actually even more important, where we have some legal ramifications. So we have to be very mindful about how we're using the software. And the first two bullets here really kind of go together. So disclosing, so removing that veil of secrecy, first clearly explaining what the data is going to be used for and what it will not be used for. Disclosing, hands down, you have to disclose that you're doing this monitoring. That's going to get you in some companies. So what company you might gain in productivity by monitoring people without telling them, potentially, maybe lost in engagement and trust, and also potential lawsuits. Just because you can monitor doesn't necessarily mean that you should. So this is where you really should establish a business purpose and outlay a plan, what the organization's goal are for the use of the software, have a legitimate business reason that for monitoring each specific activity or event. And then don't just collect the data to collect the data, but conduct analysis also on, not every population may need to be monitored or monitored in the same way. So do you really need to monitor everyone? If so, again, make sure that monitoring is done consistently across all members of the workforce. So that's another area where you could potentially get into trouble, where you choose to only monitor subsections or segments of the workforce, and there you may be introducing unintentionally some sort of bias, right, into who you're monitoring. Next slide, I think we're going to talk about in more detail, although I think I'm going to talk about it here, but this idea of using the software for evaluative purposes, more so for evaluative than for or supportive. It's kind of the same thing, rather than punitive. And what that means is use that software in a way that might provide coaching or nudges. For example, the truck driver example I said earlier, it's really good. Let's alert them if we think they might be falling asleep, or but don't then dock them pay because they weren't fully alert on the job. Use it as a way to help promote their safety, right? Ultimately, which is really is going to benefit the worker, but productivity and performance of the company. And only use it as a piece of your performance equation, if at all. Right? Use it more about helping develop as opposed to punishing. And definitely don't publicly share this data at the individual level. So that's the kind of punitive supportive from the compliance and effectives. We've got this balance of needing to make sure people are working when they're supposed to. Are you actually in front of your computer? Are you, or have you parked your cat in front of your Zoom camera? Which my cat does all the time. So there's that balance of compliance versus effectiveness. So really, the effectiveness side is measurement at the team level, aggregated, and to help, again, improve interactions and outcomes for not the team, but individuals collectively. And then we've already talked about that balance between quantity and quality. So I think on the next section is where we're going to really start to talk about people analytics, right? I said there's part of the title of this presentation is people analytics, but I haven't really talked about it. So if we go to the next slide, just do a brief introduction here. And Tom, if you want to build this one out as well, that would be great. People analytics historically, or HR analytics, or talent analytics, you fill in the blanks. They do have various different connotations, but for purposes of today, it's kind of the umbrella term. Analytics about people. I mean, I actually define it as the application of quantitative and qualitative analysis to help make better people decisions that help drive positive outcomes for the business. So historically, or even there's still a need for this, right? But we focus on kind of looking at data that's already happened, or data based on activities and transactions that have already happened. So we've been doing a lot of work around what happened, when did it happen, where did it happen, to help us get to a place where we have more insight, right? Why did it happen? And maybe start to look at, well, how do the two things relate to one another? What needs to happen, right? So what if scenarios, right? And then moving into this more kind of forethought or foresight, predictive, kind of looking at, well, based on what we know happened in the past, what might happen in the future, and when might it happen, and what are the implications of that thing happening? And where we're at today is this need for people analytics also now to spend a considerable amount of their time focused on what I call now sight, right? So these other things are really important, but when we think about the amount of burnout, exhaustion, decreased mental health, people that, I've got pictures of my friends that just want to tear their hair out, right? We have to stop. And I would say too that the pandemic is not the only thing that is affecting workers. There are other global crises that are affecting workers from around the world. And we have to really stop. If we want to really focus on employee experience that in totality, we have to stop now and think, what are you feeling now? What are you thinking now? And finding ways to get that data in a way and aggregated and analyzed and insights shared with the appropriate stakeholders so actions can be taken, right? So if we think about, a survey that a people analytics team might send out on, how are you doing in the pandemic? Are there any things that you need, right? What your level of, how efficient do you think you are? And you may find really interesting insight about pockets of the organization or in general. Maybe it's a workplace where food is one of the benefits. You come in, you can have breakfast, lunch, dinner, drinks, you name it, right? And so you negotiate your salary based on the fact that, well, I don't have to pay for groceries. And now all of a sudden you don't have access to that, right? So that gives you the opportunity to understand and then maybe possibly react, right? Figure out ways to send food or provide discounted grocery shopping. So really addressing the now. So next slide, please. And in this slide, again, I kind of talk a lot about this now, throughout the presentation, but also we think about people analytics. Right in the beginning, we had to kind of stop what we were doing and really just focus on more operational things to help the organization respond to the pandemic. And then once we started to get a hold of, okay, where are our people? How many do we have? who's going to be home, who's not going to be home, we immediately started thinking about, okay, how and when are we going to bring people back into the workplace? And also spending some time, as I've shared an example already, of how are they feeling? How are they doing, right? And now we're at a place where we're starting to think about kind of what does the future look like? And what are we going to have to do differently? And how might we use people analytics to help support that concept or that idea of the now site? So being able to use technology to look at how people are connected and how those connections actually benefit them, and benefit levels of team cohesion and different things like that. And so what I want to do on the last slide is actually talk about the way in which people analytics can kind of compound or help out with some of the topics we've talked about today. And so we're just going to build all of this ahead of time. So, but when we think about productivity, right, people analytics can start to look at linkage analysis between your people-related your data, right, and start to look at outcomes and output as opposed to the amount of time that someone's spending, and really focus on looking at productivity kind of by establishing team-level KPIs. So being able to look at productivity and linkage, between the amount of time spent potentially, and say percent of targets achieved, number of sprints completed on time if you're in an agile environment. From a collaboration standpoint, maybe instead of looking at the number of people that I speak with or number of meetings or number of emails, right? Maybe look at there's software that can actually do the analysis, or we can pull the data ourselves to look at the ratio of collaborative time to individual time. Because one of the other negative effects of COVID is that we are always in meetings and we're always in conversation with individuals. And some of that has to do with organizations not necessarily trusting that employees can go off on their own and work on their own. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. But if we know that individuals need that one-on-one time with themselves, right, to get to get work done, right, but you need that break. So looking at that ratio of collaborative to individual time and being able to say, okay, maybe do some analysis on what's the ideal ratio, right, to achieve the outcomes that we want for the team. When we look at data that's coming from the EMS or BGT, which I actually include any software that either an organizational network analysis tool or ONA. Or ONA capabilities that may be embedded in, say, your HR system or your ERP, that is a form of monitoring. It's passively monitoring like who you're in most cases communicating with, interacting with, right? But you could start to look at that data in people analytics and start to visualize pockets of exclusion, right? So I showed an image earlier on of kind of different ways in which you've got kind of a core periphery, and then you've got all of these individuals on the outside, and some of them are grouped, but some of them are completely isolated, right? And that can also get to the heart of just your overall inclusion efforts, part of the ways, in addition to using surveys. So looking at patterns of collaboration that are linked to these team level outputs, such as innovation. Continued use of surveys, but more likely smaller question surveys, right, as opposed to these big lengthy surveys, just these touch bases to really kind of take a pulse of morale. And then the one thing that I'm the most excited about and would love to really see people analytics kind of grab by the reins is we now have an opportunity to really conduct some naturally occurring experiments in the organization. Let's say, for example, if we think about work from home, right, we may be able to actually look at different groups and how productive they are based on how many days they spend in the week or not, right? Rather than coming up with this kind of blanket kind of policy without any evidence, right? One financial firm actually looked at how the time of day affected productivity. And so they actually use quantitative business measures like number of claims and number of error rates, and then looked at different individuals and saw that some were more productive in the morning and some were more productive in the afternoon, right? This might help fuel our the data, or provide us the data that we need to make better decisions about how we're going to schedule people. So better, think about how frequently, what schedule should look like. And you may want to be able to look at, where employees are actually able to provide you the most benefit. Circadian rhythms are different. And I can tell you that I'm most effective kind of between like 10 and 6, but then again, kind of 8, 9, 10 at night. Not so good early in the morning. And it's not about being a morning person. It's just kind of like my brain doesn't really start to work until later in the day. So it's an opportunity for us to really, the people analytics function and organizations, to start to look at some of the decisions we're making and policies that we're throwing out, and whether or not those are really the right things that we should be doing based on the needs of the organization today. And so now is really the time to turn to your people analytics teams to help build and nurture the workforce of the future and provide with a good employee experience. All right, so I managed to leave time for questions. I did it.
You did, Michael. That was fantastic. That was insightful, and the audio issues cleared up when you turned off your smartphone. So that was great. We've got a few questions here. The first one is from Matthew Corrett, and Matthew asks, have you seen companies using the EMS BTT platforms as an overlay to their HCM system?
Not necessarily as an overlay, but they, I'm going to throw out a couple of, I'm not endorsing anyone, although if you want to talk offline, I'm happy to. But companies like Worklytics, there's another one called Cassiopeia. So Worklytics will actually is part of it's a Microsoft product. Not Worklytics, so Microsoft Workforce Analytics. Sorry, two different things, right? And that one with the Microsoft product, they're actually starting to look at ways to integrate the HR data with the activity data. We've seen some of the ONA, or network analysis functionality, show up in HCM systems or as early as, I'd say, 2011, 2012. But I think at that point, HR and organizations weren't ready for it. So it was kind of a nice, kind of cool little like party trick. But now we're starting to see that become more prevalent. And then we're seeing vendors in this HCM space that are kind of specialized products that very likely what we'll see is some of these players maybe purchasing them and finding ways to embed. But right now, where I'm seeing the most innovation are these standalone solutions. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thanks, Michael. Angie Shea asks, she says, I like working from home, but many work environments do not allow for it, such as manufacturing. How do you create a feeling of fairness between those that have flexibility and those that do not?
Yeah, that's a very tough question. And that is actually also something that people analytics is going to have to help kind of keep a pulse on, right? It's just this idea of perpetuating a us versus them mentality. I don't necessarily know if I have an answer to that question, but it is something we do need to pay attention to. But not even just in terms of, it's a manufacturing environment or a retail where you physically have to be there to sell something to the customer. But also even within inside of an organization, right? You've got one team that's allowed to work from home, one team that's not. And that's where I think the analysis and people analytics function can help you better understand what really is the right balance to make, and helping provide the evidence to leadership or team managers around, yeah, I know you prefer to have all your people here, but in reality, is that really necessary? And without the data to be able to show that, guess what, employees aren't going to slack off, productivity isn't going to be hurt. In fact, you may see increases in XYZ. We shouldn't be making these blanket policies. So I don't know how to answer the question about the jobs that just aren't eligible. I think there's an opportunity for us to think more about that.
Okay, thank you. Kapil Pandey asks about performance evaluation. How do you think the sort of increased level of work from home might influence performance evaluation and innovation in terms of performance evaluation? And are there any studies you could point them to?
So I know after the fact, I could probably pull some studies that I read as part of this, part of preparing for this deck presentation. But I go back to, we've been on this trend to do away with performance reviews. And, we're seeing every day another article, oh, no one's doing that anymore. Some companies are just done away with performance reviews altogether, replace them with weekly check-ins. Some companies have also done away with goals. And I think what we're going to start to see very, very soon, just like we did with the work from home kind of trend, which started, I think Yahoo was one of the, Best Buy, IBM obviously was doing it way before anybody. But then all of a sudden, all these companies that were known for it said, oh, no, we're calling everybody back to the workplace because of X, Y, Z. We found, it actually decreases things that matter to us, like innovation, which actually to a certain extent is true. But that doesn't mean you can't come up with other ways to encourage innovation and work around that. But now we're seeing the same thing, right? With the performance, we don't have, as an employee, I don't have a clear way of understanding, am I on the right track? And that weekly check-in is helpful, right? But we shouldn't, how are you going to measure, right, my performance at the end of this, especially if we're, how do you measure collaboration, true collaboration, outside of what companies are trying to do, right, which is through number of meetings, right? We really have to start to focus on the output, right? Not so much about how long I worked doing something, how long was I on my computer, but when I was on my computer, what did I accomplish? So much more emphasis on the outcomes, the output, but we have to balance that kind of team level versus individual contributor level in terms of how we evaluate performance. So there's a lot more that we don't know than we do know, but it is an opportunity, again, for people analytics to come in and try and help you understand that balance.
An anonymous contributor makes the point that in the unionized setting, workplace monitoring is now a mandatory topic of bargaining.
Yes. Yep.
And another anonymous one, do you think that the company that has already decided they aren't going to have an in-person workforce full-time again because of the cost benefits to not having to pay for office space will still be able to work with their employees to find a schedule that works for them, that helps the employee perform at their best?
So I think if I paraphrase, for the companies that have decided that they want to go fully remote, right, for cost reasons, is that, did I get that right? Okay.
Yes.
Well, I wish that companies weren't making the decision just because it was cost savings. I wish it would be more about the people and what's beneficial for people. And again, what is the question about that?
So the question was, do you think that a company that's already decided they aren't going to have in-person anymore, will they still be able to work with their employees to find a schedule that works for them?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's going to vary by industry. It's going to vary by the function within your organization. But if they've decided to go fully remote, yeah, obviously. So what I've been seeing from some companies is, look, we're going to be fully remote, right? But if you want to come into the office, we'll support that, from time to time. So setting up kind of scheduling for you to come into the office. It's not that they may shut down a lot of their kind of satellite offices, but you still, if you're near a headquarters, right, encouraging, or providing opportunities for you to go into an office if needed or wanted. But I do think that if you're the type of person, it's kind of like before, right? If you're the type like I was, where working from home was really kind of a top 3 when I was looking for a job. I think we're going to start to see people say, you know what, I don't want to work for that company because 100% of the people work remotely. So it's going to become another deciding point for individuals about, is that really a company I want to work for? Am I going to thrive there? Or do I need to be in an environment where I actually can interact with people on a regular basis in person?
In fact, in the news today, I was reading that PricewaterhouseCoopers in London is going to allow its 22,000 employees that move away from the 9 to 5. And as long as there's a balance of about 60% with working with colleagues or meetings to 40%, you'll be able to devise your own schedule going forward.
Yeah.
Which I
you
think
know what what I like about that is I've worked for a lot of global companies, and we tend to be very US, if it's a multinational company, that US headquarters or presence, we tend to be very US centric and say, okay, well, if you're, let's say, in India, you're going to have to meet during our hours, right? I think this is going to be an opportunity to provide a little bit more equality, so that every once in a while, guess what? You might have to get up at 6 a.m. for a call. So I don't know. I think we might be able to kind of even out, the experience of employees that may be working in different parts of the world as well.
So there are a few more questions, but there is this one final question
Okay.
from Anonymous, which I will ask you. It's a short one for a short answer. Thanks so much for all the insight. For an HR beginner, what's the best place to start learning HR analytics? To which the answer probably involves come to Albany Law School and do HR.
Well,
I'm not trying to put words in your mouth.
Yeah. If that individual or anybody would like, send me an email. I actually have a whole deck on what to do to learn about this space, from all the way from formal education to certifications to thought leaders to conferences. I mean, I think there's no one path. I mean, nobody wakes up, and at least not maybe now, but back when I started, I didn't say, when I grew up, I want to go into HR. And I didn't even know what HR analytics was. So there is no, even when you look at, take 100 people analytics professionals, just randomly, there's no like one path, right? So it's mixed and varied. But what I can say personally that has helped me kind of fill in the blanks is attending sessions like this, looking at certificate programs if you're not able to go to school full time, and maybe financially that, so learning little bits here and there, reading on LinkedIn, taking Coursera or MOOC, any sort of MOOC, LinkedIn Learning. It's not about, it's like chunking your learning and learning from different sources in different ways. That I do that personally in my own development, but I also with my students, I provide them kind of different paths of ways that they can try and expand their knowledge and understanding of the people analytics space.
Michael, I want to thank you. You've been fantastic. The insight and the examples that you've given have been very useful. You've covered a whole range of things, from the sort of technicalities of people analytics all the way through to the regulatory and legal implications. So I want to thank you very much for being a great speaker, and to everybody who came as well. Thank you for coming. Michael will answer those questions that we weren't able to cover. We will send out a recording as well, but please look out for our next event on April the 14th on the cannabis law, the path to legalization in New York. Please enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks again for coming.
Thank you.